the chat, and you can also raise your hand and we can call on you if you want to verbally state your question. Another one is that we have Spanish interpretation available. Shout out to Maida, our comrade, who is doing that for us. So that is also an option. And I believe, yeah, there's an interpretation button available for you all there. And then I want to also give a shout out to our people helping us with tech and interpretation. Melody's doing tech, and Matthew is helping with run the interpretation as well. So let's go ahead and get started. Umbiak Gindi Sengitamu Naokawa Bogel Winge Iweri Omu. My name is Jennifer Marley, and I'm from the Pueblo San Ildefonso. I'm happy to be moderating this morning panel. I've been with the Red Nation for about 6 years, and I'm a co-founder of the Pueblo Feminist Caucus of the Red Nation. And today we're joined by 3 amazing panelists, Kayan Benali, Blanca Estevez, and Samar Arabi. And so if you would like to introduce yourselves to get started, let's go ahead and do that. Thank you again for being here. You can go in any order.
I can start if that's all right with everyone. Hey everyone, thank you for being here today. My name is Kayan Benali. I am also a member of the Red Nation. Kayan Benali initially Doki Ani Bashichin Torichini Dashache Kitlichini Dashanella. That's who I am, and I'm happy to be here today. Thank you.
Good morning, Blanca Estevez. She, her pronouns. I am coming from occupied Osage land and happy to be here this morning with y'all.
Hello, my name is Samar Arabi. I am a member of the Arab Organizing and Resource Center. I am normally in occupied Ohlone land in the Bay Area, but I'm currently in DC for the People versus Fossil Fuels Summit. And it's great to be here.
Thank you all so much. So let's dive right in. And again, these questions are optional, but I'm going to present them to all of you. And the first one is, how did you get involved with organizing? And can you tell us a little bit about the context from which you're organizing? So, maybe tell us a little bit more about the organizations you're with, the kind of organizing you do, and where you organize.
I'll start with this one, if that's okay with everyone. So again, my name is Blanca Estevez. I was made in El Salvador during the Civil War. I come from, my abuelita was 100% Pipil Mayan in El Salvador. How did I get involved in organizing? It's been passed down from generation to generation, honestly. And I currently live in what's known as Arkansas, Northwest Arkansas, where the Walton Empire comes from. I mean, I live like 15 minutes away from the headquarters of one of the worst employers in the nation. And, organizing as an Indigenous woman of color in a conservative state, Southern state, the second state where right to work was really implemented, has been very, very difficult, but it pays off. It's a long game. So you're probably never going to see some of what you've sown, but you do it because you believe in it, and you believe in the people, you believe in everybody that you come from, all of your ancestors, your generational humans. And we were forced to flee during the Civil War to the US, and growing up not knowing that the US meddled into the Civil War has been very, very difficult, and has really informed, as I've developed politically, has informed really how much stronger I go and become better at just being a support system for others that are just finding their footing, really. So knowing that you're going to sow, not necessarily reap what you sow, but you do it for the long game, has been very informative for me, at least. And in my organizing, I know that I'm just one person, and we can really make a difference. And you can see it when you start just really being like a cheerleader for people that are just starting to come into the movement, and telling them not to give up, and knowing that you have, how can I explain that? You can make people feel good about what they're doing instead of making them feel bad. We do live in Barbary, but it doesn't have to be this way, and we can really change it. So thank you.
Thank you so much for that.
I can just note briefly that I think, like, you know, as with any Arab immigrant, you're never really that far from the like implications and trauma of U.S. colonialism. You know, I was displaced from when I was 5 from the first U.S. invasion of Iraq. I was living in Lebanon during the Israeli invasion. Like, there's just a constant stream of violence and displacement as a result of the sort of things that are happening, like through U.S. colonialism and its proxies in the Middle East and North Africa. But I think organizing was, you know, I did a lot of student organizing as an undergrad, but I think I really hit my stride when I moved to the Bay Area, and I really found a group of folks that really helped me channel, I think, what felt like a lot of rage and despair that felt, you know, like a sort of sublimation of that into the power of collective action, and realizing that a group of people mobilizing together can really do some remarkable things. So most of the work that I do now is with the Arab Resource and Organizing Center, obviously, which is a grassroots organization that, you know, works to empower our community towards justice and self-determination on a host of issues. But I'm sure more about that will come up in other questions.
Again, my name is Kaim Benali. I was born and raised on the Navajo Nation, Navajo or Diné, whichever you prefer. I actually got involved in organizing when I was a student at the University of New Mexico. I started out mechanical engineer, jumped to business, tried engineering, and none of that, I didn't care for any of it. And then it was actually around the same time I got involved. The earliest iteration of Red Nation was doing I think it was like a racist tour of UNM, and they're like highlighting all the areas of like the campus and like things that went on there. And I just really enjoyed the way they were talking. Like, it made a lot of sense. It wasn't like anything that was trying to hide what it was. They were just pointing it out clear and simple. And as I just kept learning more and more and more, I started making more connections with my upbringing from like growing up in a border town known as Gallup, New Mexico. And I just stayed because I felt like it just made a lot of sense, and it really helps you explain like the world we live in as like Native Americans in the Imperial Core. So thank you.
Thank you so much, all of you, for those intros. And I think it's incredibly important that, you know, the audience understands where we're coming from, what our backgrounds are, and, you know, how the kind of work we do differs, but it also overlaps. And so my next question that I'm hoping you all can kind of expand on that is, how is organizing outside the US, or organizing with people from outside the US, different from organizing here in the Imperial Core?
I can kind of get that started. So I've just a little bit of context. I've been on one major delegation, and that was to Venezuela, and we were invited on like an international solidarity or international delegation. And there I learned a lot. I learned a lot, in particular that I feel like when you're trying to organize within the US, there's like literally, I feel like the imagination of people who live in the US stops at the border. So the moment I literally passed the border and literally just went into the rest of the world, I just saw the implications and the effects the US has across the world. Like, I really don't think we see just how devastating and how violent the US can be until you leave the US. But I think that's the main thing I saw, is just no one is confused by what the US is outside the US. Everyone sees it for what it is. And I see Native folks, I feel like we're just kind of confused because you can't really see what it is when you're like literally living in it and like kind of sort of benefiting from it as well. And that's just kind of what I feel like the honest truth is us Native Americans, we're very disparaged, and the US is against us. But I do feel like it's nothing compared to what others face around the world.
Thank you, Kyan.
I would like to say first, I was so nervous on the first question. Thank you so much, everybody, for bearing with me. I forgot to say that I'm here representing Machete Mate, I believe, and I'm also a member of the Democratic Socialists of America. We also sent a delegation to Venezuela this year, and I helped coordinate it. It was beautiful to see some of the folks that have never left the US really go and experience what it's like, and to come back and say, these humans have so much hope and they're so happy to be in community with each other. And it's something that the US does not have. It's something that our society has lost, or maybe never had, honestly, and has taken out humans that do love to be communal in spaces. But really the important work that we must do in the US is to draw attention to the military-industrial complex. It's here, it's in our backyard. It's what's hurting not only us, not only Native American folks here in the US, but also outside of the US. And it doesn't stop. And we often don't see it. We don't see it on the news. We have to go, and there's barriers, obviously, for reasons. It's just important to and it's also important to let people outside of the US know that we support them. Really, that's really to stand in solidarity with them. Statements that are written from some of our organizations mean so much to folks when they're translated into the language of the people that we're standing in solidarity even more. So I just want people in the US to recognize that we have a ton of privilege living in empire. There's so much power that we all have together to push back on some of this, all of the atrocities that the US, the military industrial complex does. And as US citizens, residents, anybody that wants to join the fight, please, we have so much space for you, and we really need you, because we can't really do any of this without you. Yeah, so it's just a lot. There's so many news. I hope that everybody follows Red Nation. I hope people follow Machete Mate, who do a lot of Latin American podcasts on everything. So there's really a lot that we can learn. There's so much more we can learn from people outside of the US if we just lean on them, if we let them lead, if we stand in solidarity with them.
Yeah, I think that's really beautifully said. And, you know, one of the things that what I heard from both of you is one of the things that's most striking about organizing outside of the US or experiencing struggles outside of the US is that folks out there are very keenly aware of what is happening in the US. It's not uncommon for Palestinians to be like marching for George Floyd or, you know, against the kind of prison industrial complex. But that doesn't always work the other way around. And, you know, there's a certain irony to that, given that, you know, like US empire is often, if not always, complicit in the suffering of people overseas, right? Its reach is just so broad and its impacts are so widely felt that, you know, just by virtue of being part of US empire, right, it's causing all of these problems elsewhere. But, you know, Palestinian farmers ain't done nothing to the US, right? But like they're still keenly aware of what's happening here, but folks here are not very aware of what's happening there. And I think it's critically important for folks in the US in particular to speak up, not only out of solidarity, but also to undermine the narrative of the US government or right, US imperial ambitions that's claimed to be doing things on behalf of people in the US when that's not in fact true at all. They couldn't give less of a care about people in the US, right?
Yeah, that's right. Powerful words from all of you. And that's, you know, those are important things that I hope, you know, the audience takes away is that we have everything to learn from our relatives outside the US and our relatives in the global South, especially the places and people that are most impacted by US imperialism, right? So my next question is, what other liberation struggles do you want Native people in the US to know about? Because we are, you know, the indigenous people of this land, you know, we in Red Nation believe that we always must be pushing struggles, or we must be pushing for the struggle to end occupation everywhere because we are occupied here, right? And so we are always implicated in the harm that the US does anywhere else, being, the first people to, undergo that imperialist violence and occupation. So what would you say, to our audience? What do you want Native people to know? Yeah.
I'll go first for this one, if that's okay, with others. So I just want to say, of course, there's no struggle more important than the struggle of Indigenous people to get their land back. Number one, let's just put that out there. Their struggle is seen playing out across the Americas and across the world, where Aboriginal people have been pushed aside by settler colonial society. I think Native peoples here, I think Native peoples everywhere have always played a vanguard role in struggle throughout Latin America. In my native El Salvador, it is Indigenous Mayan and Pipil peoples that are at the forefront of protecting the environment as water protectors, water defenders. In neighboring Honduras, it is an Indigenous environmentalist, Berta Cáceres, who gave her life to protect the natural beauty of Central America. And Native peoples are part of the intersectional struggle of the working class that all peoples across the world engage in. As a socialist and as a plurinationalist, I think it's important to recognize the role Native peoples play in the greater class struggle, both in the US and throughout all of the Americas and the world. We can never forget the role capitalism has played in exploiting Native societies, lives, communities. If we're able to ever be free, dismantling capitalism is the biggest part of that. I do also want to take a moment to say that this weekend, Berta Cáceres' daughter, Olivia Zúñiga Cáceres, was attacked for defending human rights against the violent Honduran right. So if there's anything that we need to join together, there are Native people here in the US, but across the world as well. And just pay attention to what's about to happen in the Americas in the rest of this year, and especially next year, as we have all of these elections where folks are really fighting against violent right regimes.
Yeah, I guess I totally agree with all of that. And I think one particular example that going to be unsurprising coming from me, but the struggle in Palestine, I feel like, is such a clear opportunity to see, like unmasked in its most basic form, the ongoing process of colonialism, right? That exists everywhere. And I think the distinction that I'm sure folks are aware of between colonization as something that happened and colonialism as an ongoing project and process that exists. I mean, we can see exactly what's happening in line 3 is really no different. And I think Palestine shows you a really clear, distilled example of that and all the facets of it, right? Not only the occupation of land, not only the displacement of indigenous people, but also the stealing of natural resources, right? The diversion and commodification of basic things like water, like the forced immiseration of a local community, and they're like the use of that community to sort of transform it into cheap labor that the overlying colonial society relies on. All these things exist in like clear as day processes in Palestine. And you see them mirrored everywhere, particularly here. And I think the struggles that we've been seeing right now over indigenous land and water is a really clear parallel to that. And I think we can also learn from these struggles that have been taking place for decades, if not centuries, to resist colonialism and to resist US empire, and to learn that to take the tools and the ideas and the ideologies that have been baked as a response to these systems of oppression, I think is a really valuable learning tool for all of us everywhere.
So I don't have anything like any specific struggle that I want to highlight, but I would say I would like Native people in the US to focus on anywhere there is sanctions. And I say that simply because if they're under sanctions, it's most likely because that place is doing something right and they're actually attempting to break away from the US, and they're actually, or at least from like the global narrative, and actually trying to do something different. So, and I think Native nations in general have a lot to learn from that, because they are doing it. And I think a lot of the times we're so focused on like the nation to nation relationship, but without even looking beyond just the Native nation relationship to the US and actually practicing true sovereignty. And I think that's really what I would say to Native people is like whatever you're seeing on the TV, on Fox News, CNN, sure, take it with a grain of salt, but read more into it. Read more about why they're being sanctioned. Why? Because they're trying to feed you a narrative that's saying they're doing evil things to the people that live there. But the fact is, it's the U.S. that's doing all the evil things. That they're the ones that are holding them back. They're the ones that are holding back a true, I guess, global revolution. And that's really it.
Yeah, and sorry, I know I've already talked, but just to know, just because I think that's such a critical point, Kai, that I think sometimes we see sanctions as an alternative to militarism when in fact it is just another tool of militarism. And it's part of this process of the forced immiseration of a people, and to break down the will and capacity and economic power of that people. So yeah, I just wanted to say, great point.
Could I also add something to that? When the US sends humanitarian aid, please look into that. Figure out why exactly they're trying to get into that country and what resources do they have. Because usually that humanitarian aid from the US does not come with zero strings attached. So please, that's another thing when you think, oh, we're doing something great. Why is Venezuela not taking this package of stuff? And you're like, wait a second, there's something more to that. So always, anything that the US is feeding you, please definitely look into it some more.
Thank you so much for that. Those are very important points. And I hope, our listeners and audience today do take it upon themselves to look into, the way these nefarious relationships the U.S. has with other people facilitate the project of imperialism, even if it's, talked about as being for their own betterment or their own well-being. And I think Native nations especially should be able to relate to that, right? There's always ultimatums for whether or not we receive federal monies. If we wanted to attempt to engage in trade and commerce with another nation, they would likely sanction us by cutting our federal monies and federal funding. So that's something I'm always reminding people too, is that, we could be like any of these other nations if we decided to, push, if we decided to enact sovereignty in a way the US didn't agree with, right? Thank you so much for those very solid examples. And I especially loved your example, Summer, of looking to Palestine as the most clear and distilled example of what settler colonialism looks like right now. Definitely the most blatant contemporary example for sure. And that's why I want all natives to look to Palestine, because Palestine's freedom is our freedom, right? Thank you so much, everyone. So I'm going to move on to our next question. And that is, how can we as Native people in the imperial core avoid buying into US exceptionalism? So of course, US exceptionalism in this case, meaning that, it's the primary narrative the US says about itself. It's a story the US says to itself that we're the freest, we're the strongest, we're the richest, and can do no wrong, right? The world's moral authority. So how can Native people avoid buying into that?
I can start with this one. Don't listen to your uncles and aunties. You can start there. I mean, definitely look to them for like their leadership in your family and things like that. But a lot of the times, I think when you're not trying to learn these things on your own and you just listen to stuff you hear in your family, maybe stuff you heard from your uncle that served in, I don't know, Iraq back in the day. I think everything they're taught and they're made to believe, they didn't buy into U.S. exceptionalism per se, but I think they were just force fed it to the point, like they regurgitate it. They regurgitate what they're told. They make you feel like that's what the right way is supposed to be, how the world is supposed to be seen. And if anything, don't buy anything at all. I really don't know. That's all I can say is just be careful of like who you're listening to. mainly because I think as Native folks, we're very encouraged to respect your elders, to listen to your elders. And I think it's very true. You should listen to them, but also you should know that I feel like from their upbringing, they were just taught things, they were shown things that weren't necessarily right, maybe right at the time, and just allowed them to live a life that they wanted. And I don't blame them for it. I think life is a very tough struggle, but that's it. Just be cognitive of the stuff we're upbringing. Like, just because it's tradition or it's what we're supposed to believe has always been the way it is. Just be careful.
I'll go next. So I think it's important for Native people and all people in the United States to recognize that the prosperity or sense of security that some people are able to enjoy in the US is fueled off of global South exploitation. For Native peoples and all peoples in the US to have solidarity with the rest of the world, that means rejecting the US exceptionalist narrative in favor of a more plurinationalist narrative of all peoples within the Americas and the world coming together. And yes, that does mean changing your lifestyle as US Americans and embracing concepts such as buen vivir, which means reducing the consumption to levels that are more sustainable for our earth. And US exceptionalism is what fueled Manifest Destiny and the destruction of Native communities in the US. US exceptionalism is what devastated Central America in the 1980s and forced me and my family to flee our motherland. So I feel like if we're able to truly get land back and the freedom that we want for everyone, we are going to have to start rejecting concepts like US exceptionalism, pushing back for total open borders and amnesty for all. Like a world without borders is what I would like to see, of course.
Yeah, I honestly don't have much to add. I think both of those responses were great. I'll just note that one handy shorthand is look at the things that the US is saying about its enemies, find any description of those things, and it is a perfect reflection back on US empire and the way that it acts. There's always a projection, and this is like an old colonial trope, right? There's always a projection of your own worst attributes onto the people that you are subjugating as an excuse for the subjugation of those people, when in fact, anything you hear about, people whose only language they understand is violence, and look at how they treat their women. Like, you just have to turn around and be like, oh, no, that's the society that we live in right now here. But I think the other aspect of US exceptionalism that I think particularly in like the organized active left really need to bear in mind is, I think we are sometimes victim to an idea of US exceptionalism where we give the US this sense of omnipotent agency, where like its brilliant machinations are behind everything that happens in the world, that there's some, small group of hyper brilliant people who are somehow figured out how to subjugate everybody. But like, no, right? The US is a bumbling giant, that does not know what it's doing and is not capable of understanding the implications of its actions. And I think it's almost comforting to think of them as a sort of evil mastermind of the world, but in fact, it is just global capital following the path laid out by global capital. There are no individuals who are coming up with brilliant strategies. It is just, on its like direct, inescapable path towards its own demise, right? And I think it's important not to give too much agency to US empire as being brilliant, when in fact all it is strong and violent, which is not the same thing.
Heck yeah, I love that. I love that so much. Right. And, I think a lot of people, when they start becoming aware of the violence of capitalism, they can get demoralized. They can see things for what they are and have a correct analysis, but, they lose hope and they don't see a way out because they give it that power, because they give it that agency in their mind. So I think, it's a part of revolutionary optimism to also acknowledge that, the US doesn't have the power that we sometimes give it in our minds, even if we're critical of it. And that, there is a way out. There is an option for a better world, and it's buildable, and people have been working towards it. So thank you so much for that. All right. I'm loving this conversation so far. And it's only 11:35. It seems like we've been here a lot longer. And we only have like 2 questions left. So I think we're going to have a good, fruitful Q&A. Okay, so the next question is, what can we do to amplify the struggles of people outside the US? And what action can we take as people here in the imperial core?
I can start with this one. So as far as amplifying the struggles of people outside the US, I think the actions that most Native people who at least are like aware of like international issues and struggles is just hold demonstrations, hold events, hold I don't know, even something as simple as a study group. Learn about the struggles, learn about the history. If anything, if you're at that level, host some delegations, bring people home to where you come from and learn from one another. I know we hosted AROC in the past as well, and a few other organizations, and that was very fruitful. I mean, it definitely helped solidify my understanding of the world and why we should be supporting Palestinian struggles and vice versa. So I know, like, for example, we there have been several actions that take place within Winderock, which is the capital of the Navajo Nation. And I think all you're doing is creating more visibility. And sure, everyone, you won't capture everyone's attention, but those few that you do speak to and are willing to pay attention, they'll learn, they'll change, they'll speak on this, they'll understand. And those are the folks we should be like trying to focus on. Those are the folks that we should be trying to engage with. And I think that's the best way we can amplify these struggles.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah, and I'd only add that similar to the question that you asked earlier about the connections between these struggles, like listen, right? Like folks over there are listening very closely to the struggles that we're having here, and it's incumbent on us to do the same. Like we have the responsibility to do that as well, and folks will tell us, right, what they're looking for. And if we look to the struggle in Palestine, there are a very clear set of asks and demands for international solidarity, right? And among those are BDS, boycott, divestment, sanctions, which is a meaningful, concrete action you can take in your individual life to boycott Israeli goods, but also to contribute to institutional divestment from Israel and international sanction of Israel. And these are things that you can actively participate in to isolate and to shame Israel as the apartheid state that it is, and to understand that that is part of the broader struggle against U.S. imperialism, right? That the undermining of U.S. imperial agent in the Middle East is the undermining of U.S. empire everywhere. But in addition to that, I think you can look up BDS resources online, find things that that you can do personally. There's really no shortage. And one of the ones that came out recently, just this past year, was as a response to the assault on Gaza, but also generally, Palestinian trade unions have been calling for the blockade of Israeli ships from docking at ports in the U.S. and elsewhere. And what we've seen over this past year is a really concerted effort to meet that demand, and AROC in San Francisco successfully mobilized a large enough community built through this sort of interlinkage between, Arab American community activists and Arab American community members, but also unions and other folks of color and different activist communities to block an Israeli ship from docking in Oakland, and successfully keeping any Israeli ship from docking in the Bay Area for 10 years running now, and I think, and maybe in perpetuity, because the line that was supposed to come through Oakland, they've now cut that off of their line. So that sort of action can be magnified in other places and replicated, because there are no shortages of docks where actions can be taken. And those like meaningful direct actions can have tangible material and economic consequences, And it's something we're seeing in Ireland and South Africa and other places in the world. So yeah, check out the AROC website for resources on that. It's not that hard to put together an action to do a block the vote, and it has really meaningful implications. And again, it's a response to a direct request from an oppressed people, right?
Both great answers. I'm just going to add a little bit and just highlight again how translating messages into different languages, from different languages into English, and from English into other languages, so that the world really gets to become more educated on these issues. But definitely the most important thing, I think, will be to translate them into English, because the news is not telling us anything. The media is not telling us. And even independent media will have a skew on things. So would just be really great to have messages translated so that US leftists can become and become more educated on these issues.
Can I add on some else? I just wanted to add on to what Samir said, and that's it's important to amplify the struggles, because if you don't, the people like Israel will come home to where we're at and try to distort the narrative that is taking place. I say that only because the Navajo Nation, I feel like Israel has started to kind of take a foothold here, and I know even, for example, the church right down from where I live right now, they're adamantly supporters of Israel without even realizing that we have more in common with Palestinians than we do with Israelis. So I just want to add that, I guess, concrete example.
Yeah, it's really nefarious the way Israel tries to build connections with Native people and like uses the narrative of like us having shared history as the people who survived genocide, or like, you know, whatever else they want to bring up, in order to get us to support like what is literally a settler colonial project. And so, but yeah. Anyways, I'm gonna leave that rant for later. We can rant about Israel all day, right? um, Thank you so much for those answers. And I want to move on to our last question, and then we can open it up for a Q&A. So what are the main ideas you want the people watching today to take away from this, to take away from this conversation and everything you've said?
Oof, there's a lot, but I guess my quick takeaway, just from hearing from all of you and the fascinating things that you all have had to say, is the interconnectedness of all of these struggles, right? And I don't think that's a surprise for anyone to hear, but like obviously that sort of international solidarity is not only critical, but it's essential, right? It's baked in that these struggles aren't just interconnected; they're interdependent. And the way that, you know, particular groups of people are marginalized and oppressed has global ramifications and continue to, right? And I think this like moment right now of, you know, we were talking about this earlier today, actually, about climate conjuncture, right? Shows you the kind of interconnectedness of all of these different pieces, that resource extraction in one place causes a climate catastrophe somewhere else, and the militarization required to access those resources causes another group of people to be subjugated. So this idea that like, you know, these anti-colonial struggles, these liberation struggles, these climate justice struggles are all interconnected struggles for a global liberation, right? And a movement past not only US empire, but past global capitalism into something new and something transformative. And that only comes through the kind of shared understanding of the commonalities of the struggle and the attack on these underlying structures of oppression at all of its different points, right? So everyone has a different role to play, but those roles are connected. And the more you can see those connections, the more effective that fight back actually becomes.
I'll add that always be paying attention to the rest of the world. You cannot be a socialist or a leftist without being a proper anti-imperialist. And it is up to us here in the US to be combating the war machine. I'm always going to keep saying that. And it is up to us to recognize that the indigenous struggle does not stop at the US border. And there are indigenous peoples and movements in Central America, South America, the rest of the world that have so much to teach us. So many lessons that we must learn. And if we are ever to be the war machine and beat capitalism, again, it means embracing some of those ancestral indigenous roots with Southern American concepts like buen vivir. So that's really what I want everybody to take away from this.
Same. I echo what everyone was saying. Also, too, it's important to pay attention to what's going on to the international arena, mainly because I feel like when the US fails internationally, it tends to come back harder on us, Native nations within the imperial core. And I just say that especially now with the whole new green initiative from the Biden administration. So that's really it too. I would say is just pay attention, and I'll leave with this: the best piece, or what I was told while I was on a delegation, was the rest of the world is waiting for natives to kind of get off their ass and start doing something really meaningful. That was told to me, and I'm just telling everyone else here that a lot of folks everywhere else feel as though we're holding up the global revolution. So
Thank you. Mic drop. And I hope that's, you know, something that y'all really remember too, is like they are waiting for us. Everybody else in the world is waiting for us, you know, indigenous people, colonized people, poor people, people of color in the United States, to get off our asses and join the fight. Because what we can do here in the Imperial Court is something that they cannot do. And like, there's a famous quote from, the late and great Che Guevara, who said, "I'm jealous of the comrades in the US because they get to fight the beast." And I think we need to remember that that is our obligation, especially as Indigenous people here. So I'm going to open it up for Q&A now. Oh, and also, like, Kai has a really cool story about finding a Venezuelan oil barrel in his backyard, because at one time, people don't know this, Venezuela, literally no strings attached, gave propane and oil and gas to native people where there's no gas, or where there's no like electricity or no warm water, including Nick's Res, like Lower Brule. He said they gave him propane, and like there was why was there a Venezuelan oil barrel posted up in the Navajo Nation? It's because they actually care about us. It's because they know that we're struggling and we're suffering and we're in the same fight too. And unlike, the kind of misleading deals the US strikes to other people when they offer aid, there was literally no strings attached in this case. So I think it's important to remember that they're willing to have our backs, even though we might not be aware of what's going on too. All right. So let's go ahead and open it up for Q&A then. Like I said, you can feel free to type questions in the chat or raise your hand and we can unmute you.
Don't be shy.
All right, we got one. It's from Nadia, our comrade. All right. It says, is there a particular joint action campaign or target that we should consider as a global community in this moment? Looking at the same imperial military and corporate actors that are targeting our communities across the world, what could be our shared response? Or is there a particular historic example of joint struggle to learn from? I'll put it in the chat so y'all can see it.
I think I'm going to sound like a bit of a broken record at this point, but Palestine is a clear example of these sorts of struggles, right? It's something that the entire global community is sort of invested in, that there's a large, broad swath of community support for the Palestinian cause outside of the US, although also growing here. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, that there's a real power, I think, in using an example, like a more clear, simpler example that then is used as a weapon to undermine broader US colonial efforts everywhere, right? And so like understanding the role of militarism, the way that, like the interconnectedness of the Israeli struggle in ways that, okay, Israeli military forces are training private security and police actors here in the US. So it ties directly back to like Black repression and police repression more generally, the water resources that are being stolen from Palestinian lands and then sold back to Palestinians at a markup at a scarce amount, like ties directly back to the water protector stuff that's happening here, right? The underlying resources, the natural gas that's being exploited off the coast of Gaza, it's killing all the fish and ruining the livelihoods of Gazan fisher people, one of the only remaining economic activities allowed in that area under sanction, ties right back to kind of global issues related to resource extraction and exploitation. The exploitation of Palestinian labor as cheap labor, again, also ties back to these like global systems of oppression. So using an example like that, that the international community can rally around, that then ties back to broader struggles, I think is a really powerful way to not only fight for a particular really important cause, but then to use that as ammunition for our broader battles, you know.
Go ahead, Kai.
Oh no, I was just gonna nothing major, but nothing major, but I was just gonna uplift Line 3, of course, the Line 3 campaign. It's as we all know, I think it is up and running currently, and I think we should just continue. Just because it's completed technically doesn't mean we should still try and take it down. So I just want to uplift Line 3 efforts and donate, learn about it, do whatever you can still. It's not over. Like we talk about interconnectedness, it's just one piece of the it's just one piece of imperialism that we could definitely have direct action towards.
And I'll add that in El Salvador right now, we are seeing Nayib Bukele, just a horrible, horrible president. We're moving towards this Bitcoin system there that's really hurting the poorest people. I mean, it is unbelievable. So you can also check out CISPES. They are an organization based in the US that do a lot of good work amplifying the Salvadoran community.
Thank you so much, everyone. So our next question from the audience says, what have been some effective tactics / narratives in your experience to get US residents to identify their own stakes in defecting from US imperialism?
I'll talk about it a little bit of how in the Latinx community, there's colorism everywhere. There's so much stuff, so much self-hate within ourselves about, you know, everything, everybody trying to Americanize, US Americanize or whatever to survive. I understand, I get it. And it's hurtful, it's deeply hurtful once you start to really begin to take apart what everything means. So I just want to say a kind, just being there when people are really educate, agitate, and then also be kind and humble when they're starting to really see it. And when you see it's beautiful, right? Because you know that person's gonna do the same thing's gonna happen. They're gonna be there for somebody else once they start realizing what imperialism has done to our lives currently and what it's done in the past to our families. So that's really what I educate, agitate, and then remain there for people.
I think maybe one tactic or narrative that I think could benefit or help people identify their own stakes in defecting from US imperialism, particularly is militarism. And I only say that because I feel like the weapons that they use to suppress and destroy these movements, they are typically created within the US. And I say that because here in the Navajo Nation, I know they have companies like Raytheon, and I think there's another one, but I know those are some companies that are responsible for producing weapons they use against people all over the world. And you mean it's evidently apparent that they're just the same weapons are used against anyone else. And I think it's just it's really wild to see that militarism is like one thread that you can identify, like one commonality. So that's really it. I think it's important to point out that militarism is everywhere, imperialism. So,
And I would just add very briefly that in some sense, it's a sort of impossible question to answer, just because, like, okay, you know, there's this sort of core set of narratives that I think are particularly effective, you know, and I think people have shown, right, there's been like research and things done by folks that say like a sort of integrated class race analysis works particularly well for showing people, you know, ways that they are in fact being exploited by others. But I also think that at its core, convincing folks and bringing folks into the movement is an iterative process of listening and adapting, right? And I think a big part of that is to hear, what people's concerns are, to really hear, and to not come in with a pre-baked set of responses and solutions that we all feel like are the correct ones, but to understand, I think, that struggles that individuals are going through. And I think one of the tricky balancing acts that we have on the left is understanding that difference between, the structures and the people that inhabit those structures. And I think it's really easy to condemn the structures as being really oppressive and really problematic, but the people who are stuck in those structures and don't necessarily know better, don't have opportunities to have thought otherwise, like, we need to be careful to approach those people with compassion, right? Like, we don't, it's not, it's the military, it's not the soldier, right? It's the police, not the person. And to understand that, like, each individual's struggles are part of a, like, these people are themselves oppressed cogs in a machine, but you can't treat them as a cog. You have to understand the problems that they're going through and iterate through a set of solutions, right? This is the whole, like, going to the country idea, that you need to sit and be in dialogue with folks, and only through that iterative process do you really make meaningful change. And iterative for you too, right? Because your understanding grows based on your relations with folks. So, don't know.
Thank you so much for those very comprehensive answers. I really appreciate it. And I'm sure our audience does too. I wanted to let the audience know that we are at 8 questions in the queue. So I'm going to go ahead and cap questions for right now, and hope we can get to all of them, though we may not. So thank you, everybody, for typing your questions. So I'm going to move on to the next one. It said, I found sometimes that American activists have used the Palestinian struggle in a way that didn't take their lead. Have you found this a problem in the cross solidarity?
I can take a quick stab at that, just to say that, yes, I think, like, any movement is susceptible to appropriation. And that certainly does happen. And I think it's a particular manifestation of generally whiteness, where folks think they're like, oh yeah, like, I know the answer to this and let me speak on it. And the answer is, an organized community is louder, right? Like, we have the power of people. And I think it's just important to make sure that we as a community work on solidifying messages and calling out would-be allies that are not in fact allies. But beyond that, it's tough, I don't know, problem in every movement.
Right. Would anyone else like to respond to that, or can I move on to the next question? Good to move on? Okay. So the next one says, can you talk a little bit about what international solidarity could look like when we center Black folks in the US, as well as all the amazing Black struggle happening in Africa and Black migrants facing violence around the world? How do we include them in this conversation?
Sorry, I feel like I'm talking too much, but I'll be quick. My one quick thought about that is just that I think just generally in the history of the US, right, Black and Indigenous struggles are at the forefront of everything. And I think all movements have sort of come in the wake of the lessons learned from, like, the sort of almost like original sin of exploitation of US colonialism, right, which came on the backs and over the bodies of Black and Indigenous bodies, right? So I think what we have to learn from Black folks is everything. In the same way that, frankly, like the collective response to the Israeli assault on Gaza last year would not have looked like it did were it not for all the BLM stuff that had come immediately before it, right? And so, like, being part of that broader struggle, centering the kind of, like, core aspects of colonial domination and exploitation is always critical. And I think it works the same way internationally, right? Understanding, like, where these sort of locus of struggle exists and making sure that we're following that. Like, there's just so much to learn, and so many connections to make, right? Because again, like, those initial processes really open up your sort of discourse and your understanding and analysis of everything that comes after it. So I don't know. The answer is a lot.
Yeah, that's a really difficult question, actually. I don't have an answer quite honestly, but I would definitely say Black and Indigenous struggles are definitely interrelated just from the fact, if we look at it historically, we see that they were the subjugation of both peoples were critical to the formation of the US as it currently is. So that's all I can say about that. But also just call out anti-blackness in your family. It's kind of everywhere and it is everywhere. So if you see it, call it out and try to not just call it out, but also try to explain why it's critical that you called it out.
Right. Would you like to respond, Blanca, or can I move on?
Both answers were so great. Definitely the anti-blackness in the community is something the bare minimum that all of us can be doing. So, push back as much as you can.
Thank you all. I also wanted to add to something I like to remind people is that the language of decolonization does not come from Native people here. It doesn't even come from this continent. It comes from the Black radical tradition, and it comes from Africa. And so if we have the word decolonization in our mouth at all, we need to remember where it came from and, credit that. It comes from the Black radical tradition. And it's something that, all colonized people benefit from. So decolonization is something that we've all taken up. So we have our African relatives to thank for that. All right. So I'm going to move on to some more. What was the most compelling fact or event that made you realize the importance of Indigenous international solidarity?
I can go first on this one. So I think the one event that really got me thinking about this or solidified my understanding of the importance of Indigenous solidarity was when I went on the delegation to Venezuela. It was the the International Gathering of Indigenous Peoples, and I bring this up because I think there's a difference between, how would I say this, having a movement, but there's a difference between having a movement and a movement that has power. So from what I noticed in the global south is that sure, they are organized, but they also are politically organized and they hold a lot of weight within the political system that they are. So I think if we want to practice true Indigenous solidarity, we need to follow that kind of tradition and not just um, kind of lost what I was saying, but I just think there's importance there to know that people in the global south and everywhere else, they hold a lot of political power as compared to here in the US. So
Jennifer, you said what event? Could you ask one more question? Could you repeat the question one more time?
Yeah. So it said, what was the most compelling fact or event that made you realize the importance of Indigenous international solidarity?
Okay, thank you so much. I will say that the water defenders in El Salvador, just going up against Oceana Gold to protect the water in El Salvador was the biggest thing. It was Indigenous folks that began it, and it turned into a international coalition called La Mesa eventually, and really hold a lot of power to stop a mining company from digging up more gold in my motherland. So it took a really long time, over a decade of them organizing, educating, going everywhere to tell to get everybody involved. They even had, I know this is nuts, but they even had some Arena folks on their side, which is the right in El Salvador, super right. So they did everything. They came together. They stopped a big multinational gold mining company by organizing and by staying at it.
My favorite little example is just from the block the boat actions that have been taking place. So I mentioned that we in San Francisco, or in the Bay Area generally, right, like blocked an Israeli Zim ship, giant container vessel, like picture, those huge, like endless, covered in those containers. We stopped it from docking at the Oakland docks, right? So all this cargo that it's supposed to unload every day that it can't unload it, it's costing them millions of dollars. God knows how much, I have no idea. So blocked it at that San Francisco port for about a week. So finally gave up, tried to go up to Seattle, and also wasn't successfully able to unload in Seattle either, or Vancouver. I can't even remember where it went all over the place. But at some point, like basically giving up, the ship goes all the way up to Prince Rupert in northern Canada, just a very small town, the last possible place to unload cargo in like the North American continent where it can get on a highway and come back down to the US. And it's a small town with a large indigenous population. And we don't know anyone in Prince Rupert. I've never, like it's not something that's usually on our radars, but a bunch of indigenous folks in that community reached out and were like, oh, yeah, I mean, we would love to help with this because, yeah, we get colonialism, believe me, right? We're indigenous folks in Canada. And basically 6 or 7, I mean, at some point, I think it was maybe 10 people successfully blocked a boat from unloading for days, all right? And they've got these amazing TikToks of this like small group of indigenous folks like picketing in front of the thing to keep them from unloading. And to me, that just this like, cross country all the way up the coast, solidarity between the Bay Area and this like small Canadian town was just the most beautiful thing for me. Like just thinking about it really gets me all choked up. It's just an amazing act of solidarity,
I love that story. I didn't know that. Geez, thanks for sharing that. All those stories, powerful stuff. All right, next question. It says, what is one skill you would all say is useful for us as organizers that we must practice or build a practice around?
I would say as an organizer, I think the best skill you could learn is unlearning. I would emphasize that because I felt like, I mean, I still have a lot to learn. I still have a tons of things I need to learn, just tons of stuff I need to read. But also, it's just important to realize that a lot of the things we might preconceive as the truth or is we just have to unlearn. And until we start doing unlearning, I feel like you can actually start absorbing the real truths. So unlearning is my answer.
I'll piggyback and say that as you're unlearning, I think it's going to be really important to have militant compassion and kindness for yourself as you begin to see your role, how you played into, this world and what you can do to change it and how you can change society. Because while you are unlearning, it's hurtful. You hurt your feelings. I know I did I'm still learning so much and unlearning, but it hurts when you really see where you come from, how you got here, everything that is stacked against you. And you're going to have to be compassionate and kind, not just to yourself, but to others as they begin unlearning too.
Yeah, shoot, what can I add to that? I mean, I was going to say humility, but it's the same idea, right? That like, whatever, understanding the things that you know now, we're still wrong about something, right? Like the nature of our work is that it's constantly evolving. And to understand that like we try our best to be where we are, we're accountable in the places that we're wrong. And we learn and adjust, right? And adapt. And I think that's a really beautiful thing.
Thank you, everyone. Super inspiring, like truly. All right. Next question I have says, can you talk about the significance of the fact that 6 Palestinian prisoners freed themselves from a high security prison recently and the role of supporting political prisoners in our struggles?
Again, I think I'm talking too much, but I will just note one, what a really powerful thing that was and how amazing. I mean, it just goes to show you, I think, how brittle like these systems of oppression are, right? That a group of people can undermine like this seemingly invincible foe, right? And this idea of like the incarceration, right, and oppression and exploitation of these people feels so big and so heavy and so permanent. And now there's a symbol of Palestinian resistance that like I can literally hear. It's on my desk, right? Like now this is a symbol of liberation, which is a really amazing thing, right? That like it undermines a narrative that feels inescapable, and it just goes to show that like compassion and like an organized, compassionate response to things can produce such amazing results and can so powerfully undermine these systems that at the end of the day are built on sand, right? Because like they only work because people let them work.
Yeah, I just want to touch upon that real quick. And I know I was going to say that too. It's really inspiring, so inspiring to see that. Because just like you said, it's like you view like the US as like these monolithic, monolithic institutions that can't be toppled, but yet 6 people were able to undermine it. And if anything, shoot, where was I going with this? Um, oh, celebrate all the victories, small or big. I feel like it's just important as resistance celebration. So.
All right, we get to move on to the next question. Okay. So next one says, how do you manage the opposition you may face in your native family or family in general when trying to educate politically? Many in mine were in the military, or excuse you for being unpalatable or the militant native, and I'm shut down wherever I approach these topics. It feels like when I bring anything up, it's like I'm coming too out of left field, pun intended, and that I'm coming from conspiracy land. How do you manage this with your tribe at large? That's a good one.
Maybe I can answer this. I feel like we've all encountered that at some point. I mean, I feel like Indian country is hella militarized. Everyone in some family has had someone who'd served in some war at some point. But I think the best thing you can do is just be patient with them. I also don't think it's very productive to talk about like theory and use these big concepts and these big words, because I feel like this language is used to describe the everyday experience, but I think you should focus more on the everyday experience. Like, for example, I can think about your people in your family who might be veterans. Maybe focus on how the U.S. treats veterans as a whole after they're done serving, after they're done serving in war. Focus on things like that. Focus on things that actually matter to them, and try to come at them from that angle. But also realize, I think I said earlier, that you're not going to get everyone to come to your side, but that's not the goal. We're not trying to convert everyone. But you should know there are people who are listening, whether it be people who are younger than you, people who are older. There are folks who listen, and just know that just because you feel like you're speaking into a void doesn't mean that someone hasn't heard you. So don't give up. I think Blanca said it. Just practice compassion and just know it comes and goes. And also to just wait for the right moment. People are more willing to listen when things are going on. So
I'll also add that there are organizations out there that support About Face is a good organization that is for former military members. So I'm sure they also have resources. And just know that you're really not alone in this fight. I think a lot of us, that are from the left, that have really come into this space to where you're now, on panels talking about things, have been there in our families. I know that my mom just the other day was ranting about something. Oh, did you hear the news said this? Fidel Castro did this. And I was like, what are you talking about? Fidel Castro is not even here. What is going on? ¿Qué estás viendo? What is happening? So it's we've, let's join up. I mean, really, we're not going to be able to do this alone. And the more we talk about our experiences within our own families, I think the easier it'll get.
Yeah, and I guess like my tiny contribution here is just that change is glacial, right? Like nobody's ever had a conversation where they come out of it and like, thought the US Army was great, but after talking to you, I realized that they're awful. Like it just doesn't work that way, right? So as long as you're compassionate and not dismissive and you're hearing problems and talking about them, change comes over time. Don't give up hope.
Thank you all. And if I, as the moderator, might insert my 2 cents for that question, I have faced a whole lot of pushback for my people in general from what I do, not just my family. And I think one of the biggest mistakes I made in trying to get people to understand was becoming frustrated with them and, maybe without realizing it, making them feel belittled or, just getting angry with them. And, although all these things we learn about the US are definitely anger inspiring, we need to remember that we shouldn't direct our anger at our own people. We should only direct it at those in power and structures of power, and realize that, even when our own people are, ignorant and maybe in some ways contributing to such violence, they are also people who are learning to cope with the violence they face every day. And it's important to take things from things that people understand, because Native people especially do understand, like, class struggle. They understand these things from their lived experiences, even if they don't have the language to put to it. So I'm going to move on to our next question, which says, Blanca mentioned a term of consuming less. I have heard the term degrowth, and that is similar, or is that similar? Is there a particular arena of a consumption? This makes me think about moving towards indigenous foodways.
Yes, it's similar. And it's really just the term to focus on nature rather than economic growth. And rather than continuing to do this overconsumption of stuff, of whatever goods, returning back to nature, returning back to something sustainable. We don't need I think we used this example earlier this week. We don't need the newest PlayStation 5 or 6 or whatever. Let's try to get back to, less economic growth and more focusing on nature, returning back to law, protection of our Mother Earth.
All right, thank you. Another thing we say in Red Nation too is people who are under consuming don't need to consume less. It's the people who are over consuming that need to consume less. And so, the little grandma on the res with no running water or electricity doesn't need to consume less, even though she lives in the imperial core. She needs to actually consume more, like her relatives in the global south. All righty, so I want to move on to the next question, and it says, when we're organizing, our members might ask, why are we putting energy into supporting XYZ movement when my movement needs here aren't being met? What are ways you've redirected these conversations to build solidarity? Are there moments that stick out from organizing where you've seen solidarity grow while building capacity and leadership for meeting needs of members locally? That is a great question.
I can give an example, if that's okay. So within the International Committee of the Democratic Socialists of America, we have different subcommittees, and we have campaigns that are running separately but together. And also on a local chapter level, folks can engage in things. We're about to kick off a Cuba campaign where folks from all across the country can contribute. And I know that folks will say, why are we focusing on vaccines? Why are we focusing on like vaccine apartheid throughout the world, and especially in countries that are sanctioned? And we're throwing away vaccines here in the US every day. We're getting rid of so many thousands, wasting. So we're all connected, really. So really just have those one-on-one conversations with folks that have questions and help them understand that our struggles are actually connected. And I know that I'm using this COVID thing, but it's a pandemic and it's affecting all of us. And if one country is being treated poorly, not getting the syringes, not getting all of these medical things, it's affecting us too. And the way that it really is. It's all of us are connected. And I think once you really start to realize that, comprehend the ways in which we're all linked together, it gets easier.
I can touch on this briefly. Mainly during the BLM movement at its height, one thing I did notice is like a lot of Native folks were like basically comparing the Native oppression to Black oppression. And I think the only way you can kind of, because it doesn't make sense, right, to point out like why they're doing it wrong. Like you're wrong for thinking that. I think maybe that's like a symptom of like the cult of individuality we live in within the US. Maybe that's just the reason why they get reduced down to the individual. But like during that time, I think it was more important to emphasize that both people are being killed at high rates because of police brutality. You know, it's like not like one or the other is oppressed more, but you should just change the narrative and just shift it back to the structure. I think we talked a lot about that. You should always keep in mind that we're criticizing the structures and not so much the people that participate in the structure. So.
All right,
Yeah,
thank you. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, just to note extremely fast that like there is no separation of struggles, right? At the end of the day, like everything is interrelated. And I think the other really key piece of that is that international solidarity has to work both ways, right? It's not like solidarity for me, but not for thee. And I think one of the critical things that we need to do as folks who are looking for international solidarity is to be really plugged into the movements that are happening locally and to make those direct ties, because at the end of the day, like they really are much more related than people think they are. And opening that up opens new vistas for organizing and action, right? And I think it's important to keep those in mind.
Thank you so much, everyone, for those responses. So I want to do a time check. It's 12:22. This panel is set to go to 12:30. So I'm probably only going to have time for one more question. So now I'm just taking them in the order in which they were received. So the next one says, in the US, Indigenous identity often gets reduced to performing culture, and our history of resistance gets ignored, particularly in K through 12 education. Any advice on having young Native children recognize their own privileges living in the US and caring about international struggles given their own struggles? That is a great question.
I would like to answer it. I'm not sure if I'm going to answer it correctly, but I am going to say we need to become organized. Our side has to become organized and start taking over these school districts. There is an insane amount of power that we are giving folks when we are not organizing to take over the education systems that our children are being faced to go to school in, number one. And two, the other side is so organized. They're taking over these school districts. They're the ones that are telling us what, they're the ones that are teaching us all of the stuff that we're having to unlearn later on in our lives, all this trauma that we're having to live through. So I wanted to just answer that. I wanted to at least put that out there, that please, think about organizing, running for school board, the commitment, the time to give children, just to set them up for a better future. The other part, recognize our own privileges living in the US and caring about international struggles. Again, I think it would be great to start from a young age so that you are not having to unlearn this stuff, so that you are not having to be hurt. And we need to be there. As the left, we should also be highlighting children and making sure that they're growing up in a better world and making sure that they feel seen. we were not growing up. So why are we not making it easier for children to live a more fulfilled life? They are their own tiny humans, and we should be really highlighting them in our movements and in our struggles.
I don't know if I'll answer this correctly either, but I think about like performing identity and things like that. So I just want to touch upon like the reconnecting native discourse that I've been seeing happening a lot lately. And I only bring that up because I feel like when you're just focused only on identity and culture, I feel like you get narratives like reconnecting and I want to bring it up because it just seems a little strange that some folks uh, get uplifted for this idea of trying to reconnect to a culture when in a sense, like if you think about it broadly, aren't we all kind of like trying to reconnect with what we lost? I mean, so that's the reason why too, like I'm always thinking broadly about that. Like well, what are we trying to return to? Like some stagnant idea of like who we were in the past. But I think maybe it's more important to focus on what we can become, kind of like an idea of like imagining a future that isn't confined to like native identity. Do I know what that looks like? No, but it's an interesting question. I think we're all trying to tackle that without like offending too many people because it's not like the goal, but also knowing that I feel like within the US we're so just concerned about identity and culture, and it's dangerous when we just limit ourselves to only those things.
All right. Any more comments on that question? We good? How are the panelists feeling about taking one more question, or do we want to wrap up? You've been on here for quite a while. Okay. I think one thing I'd say in response to that too is performing culture, right, is something that is relatively recent, and it came as a response to the way, the U.S. government tried to break up revolutionary movements during the 60s with COINTELPRO, right? And that's the point at which a lot of nonprofits began to take over movements where the emphasis was to perform culture as an indication of your identity and belonging. And it encouraged this move to focus on the individual, one's individual identity, and how well somebody could perform it. And so that's why identity politics remains such a huge problem today. And they're actually institutionalized, as you mentioned, for example, within the education system, within K through 12 education. And so it's important to remember those origins, but also it's important to remember that historically, Native people did not identify people on the basis of cultural performativity, and that we have our own means of identifying citizens and, creating standards for belonging that go beyond, federal standards. And so I think in that way, it's important to remind Native youth that we aren't exceptional as Native people here in the US, that there's Native people everywhere doing similar work. There's Native people everywhere who share our struggles, and that, the narrative that history tells about Native people here isn't something we should claim as our own, because we have our own, right? Encourage students to learn about where they come from, consult their family in terms of that, but also that, cultural performance isn't going to get the goods, actually. It's kind of just for the consumption of the non-Native gaze. And if we really care about freeing ourselves, it's going to take political action. And like one of our panelists said, getting organized, which you, Morgan, are doing a wonderful job of getting these students organized. And I think teachers like you are such a blessing for our community. So thank you so much to you and all the radical educators out there doing this kind of work. And it looks like we are at about time. So I just want to leave this last minute for the panelists to say any final thoughts or statements on the topic of internationalism.
I'll just say I'm really grateful to be in struggle with y'all. It's just like so inspiring listening to all of you speak. So it's been a real pleasure, and stay connected. Not only you people on the panel, but just generally in the chat and whatever, hit us up, especially if you're around this week for the DC stuff. We should all meet up.
Thank you so much, everyone, for hanging out with us for 90 minutes today and for committing to a internationalist lifestyle. If you have any questions or anything, please hit any of us up. I believe all of us are pretty open to talking to everybody. I just met these people this morning, so I'm not telling them what to do, but I think all of us would probably be willing to talk to anybody one-on-one. If you're struggling with anything, please let us know. If there's anything that we can help, please let us know. We're all trying to walk each other home.
And it was great to be here. Thanks for having me. Honestly, I'll just say, don't be afraid to get involved. Don't be afraid to speak out on international solidarity. And I only say that because this is my first time ever speaking on it. And it was not, I don't want to be like Samir and say it was not that hard, because it is hard, but I'll just say, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to be wrong. Don't be afraid to say things you think are right, because we could spend our whole lives being right, but never accomplish anything. And that's one of the things we say in TRN. So thanks.
Thank you so much, everybody. And if the panelists, would you be willing to drop your social media handles in the chat so the audience can keep up with you? Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, wherever you can be found, if you're comfortable. Awesome. Thank you so much for tuning in, everybody. And yeah, keep up with us, keep up with our panelists, and join us this afternoon for our final keynote presentation. And that will be the event that concludes Native Liberation 2021. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and we'll see you soon. And if you're in Albuquerque or New Mexico, be sure to join us for our Indigenous Peoples Day March and Rally on Monday at 5 p.m.